Good evening. My name is Zinat Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics, and we are really pleased to welcome all of you this evening, this rainy evening. We're happy you're here. The topic of gun violence and deaths related to guns is traumatic and something that has affected our community and the greater Chicago area. So we have staff on site to provide guidance on campus resources regarding this important topic if you need it. One of our students will formally introduce our panel and moderator in a few minutes. And I just want to preview a few of our upcoming events for this week and next. So tomorrow, Thursday, October 14th, we have Congressman Chuy Garcia, who'll be joining us for a conversation with Araceli Gomez-Aldana of WBEZ Chicago to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month and to delve into the latest news from our nation's capital. On Monday, October 18th, we have a panel on faith and democracy, the role of religion in American politics. It's an all-star panel, and it's an event that we're co-sponsoring with the University of Chicago's Divinity School. This is a mouthful. University of Chicago Divinity School's Martin Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. Our panelists will include Rachel Mikva, who's a professor of Jewish Studies at the Chicago Theological Seminary, Russell Moore, who's a Pritzker Fellow this quarter with the Institute of Politics, and he's a public theologian at Christianity Today, and Asma Uddin, who's the author of The Politics of Vulnerability and a religious freedom expert. Moderating this discussion will be Brie Lascota, Executive Director of the Martin Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion at the Divinity School. Your questions. After the moderated discussion tonight, we'll open up the floor to take questions from you in the audience. So you can please line up to ask your questions. I'm looking for the mic. I'll be in the middle, right? Okay, I'll be in the middle of the room. And just remember that everybody's welcome at the microphone, but keep your mask on when you ask your question. And we usually give priority to questions asked by students. Please make sure your phones are on silent. And we are now going to hear formal introductions of our panelists and moderator from Hina Mohammed. Hina is from Croydon, England. She's a first-year student in the Harris School of Public Policy. She's an event ambassador with the IOP Speaker Series. Please join me in welcoming Hina to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. A huge welcome and thank you to all for joining us today at the International House, and this room is incredible. For tonight's event in partnership with the Institute of Politics, my name is Hina Mohammed. I am a first-year Master's in Public Policy candidate at the Harris School of Public Policy. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing tonight's brilliant panel to discuss a topic that I know is important to every one of us in this room, unpacking gun violence in Chicago. I'm sure that all of us have at one point or multiple points discussed what it means to live in this city, to live in the greater Chicago area, and with that comes a frank and serious discussion about the nature of crime and the social challenges in this city, particularly around gun violence. I can think of no better panel to speak to us today with their wealth of expertise and experience in this space. We are joined tonight by Congresswoman Robin Kelly. Representative Kelly has served the U.S. representative from Illinois' 2nd Congressional District since 2013. Representative Kelly is a co-chair of the Congressional Gun Violence Prevention Task Force and is the author of the 2014 Kelly Report on Gun Violence in America, a Congressional Analysis. Joining Representative Kelly is Ed Sullivan, a former member of the Illinois House of Representatives, representing District 51 from 2003 to 2017, and is now with the Illinois State Rifle Association. We are also joined by our very own Rosanna Ander, the founding executive director of the University of Chicago Crime Lab and Education Lab. And finally, our moderator tonight will be the Chicago Tribune's Annie Sweeney. Annie Sweeney is on the Tribune's criminal justice team and covers the impact of violence in Chicago and policies to address it. With that, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our distinguished guests.
Thank you so much. Before I start, I want to say I was on the campus just 2 days ago for a tour with a student who's thinking of coming here, and I was well aware of the academic reputation here and the rigor, but I never really thought about why that mattered, and they really drove that home. And what they kept telling us throughout the tour was, we're supposed to bring out the best in each other. And then I got a call to come moderate, and I thought, well, I'll do that. I think this topic is worthy of that kind of serious conversation. These are really troubling days in the country, in the city. I think the numbers we're seeing is stunning everyone and scaring people, quite frankly. And I'll tell you a little bit about the most recent project that I was a part of we had the opportunity at the Tribune to follow one gun, and we're going to hear about how many guns there are in this city, I'm sure, that made its way out of Wisconsin from a gun shop to the streets of Chicago. And for me, it was just a great opportunity to kind of set the table and look at all the different points, issues about gun violence in this city. It starts with a burglary. All guns are legal at some point, but this one became illegal through burglary. I'm not sure exactly how it got to Chicago. No one was charged. But once it's here, we could follow it to more than 24 scenes where we were able to observe a couple of things about guns in this city, including the gun was primarily turned up in a small geographic area, which I think we'll hear more about that tonight too. That's not unusual. We talked to numerous victims and family members. That is a story that is often done, but maybe can't be done enough because these are, life-changing events for people. So we talked to numerous people about that. And then we also had the opportunity to talk to at least one person who had the gun, and his story about why he needed that gun was equally heartbreaking to me. He had a lot of loss, grief, and fear in his life as a gun violence victim. So we put all that together, and before we jump in, I want to add this. Throughout that entire story, I'm going to have to grab water, but throughout that entire story, we also spoke to, thank you, so many people in the city who wake up every day trying to do something about it. And these are everyday citizens. And so I think that's good to keep in mind while we talk to some of the experts here who are also thinking about it. And I want to start with Rosanna to maybe talk a little bit about what we know about guns in the city, where they come from geographically, and how they do wind up making that transition from legal to illegal.
Great. Thanks, Annie, and thanks for your incredible work. We are so lucky as a city to have incredible reporting like the work that you do, which are not sort of quick turnaround overnight stories. I know the shoe leather reporting that you do, I've been a beneficiary of it for years and years, so I just want to acknowledge Annie's incredible work. So I think most of you probably know we don't have any gun stores in the city of Chicago still. We basically no gun that is recovered in crime or that comes into the city of Chicago starts in the city of Chicago in terms of its first legal sale or transaction. So all of the guns that end up here, whether they end up here legally or in the illicit market, come from other jurisdictions, either outside of Cook County. A lot of the guns that are recovered in crime in Chicago, about 40% of them come from within the state of Illinois in terms of where they were first purchased, and about 60% come from outside of the state of Illinois. So states like Indiana, Wisconsin, we have guns that come through from the south, from Georgia and places like that. I think what we know a lot about is when a gun is first purchased, we have some information about that, and then we get information when a gun is used in a crime. Almost every transaction in between, and often there are many transactions, we are completely blind to. So it's very hard to figure out what are going to be the most effective ways to disrupt the sort of transfer of guns from the legal or illicit market to the illicit market. So I think it's just important, there are lots of different pathways that firearms ultimately take. And so I think, no pun intended, I think people often look for a silver bullet, but what we probably need is a golden portfolio of approaches that help to disrupt the pathway of guns from first legal purchase to ultimately turning up in a crime. One thing that I just want to add, though, is I do think we almost exclusively focus on the end user and sort of trying to bring accountability once the trigger's been pulled on the person who pulled the trigger, and do not spend nearly enough time understanding all the people and processes that facilitate that ultimate transaction. And so I think we do need to be thinking about how do we hold accountable. So for example, to own a handgun legally, you have to be at least 21. So there's no scenario where an 18-year-old with a gun has that legally. And so we are not doing enough to understand who are the adults that are facilitating access to young people in Chicago, and how do we ensure that there's accountability up the chain when people are sort of illegally or even not knowing that they're breaking the law, allowing guns to fall into situations where they're going to be used to do incredible harm. So I think we do need to broaden our attention not just to the person who ends up pulling the trigger, but also all the people and actors that help facilitate that.
Right. Thank you. I want to pick up on what you just said about the incredible harm, because I do want to talk a little bit about the cost of gun violence, because you can think about it as a sheer financial cost, and I think we know a little bit about that, but I'd like to hear from Rosanna, and anyone else, please feel free to jump in about how we can measure this. Like, what is the impact on our city and on individuals?
Yeah, I think there are lots of economists who try to find ways to estimate both the direct and indirect costs. And I think the direct costs are certainly important. Things like medical care, things like policing costs, things like, what does it cost to create safety in schools to reduce the likelihood that guns are used to harm children. So there are ways to measure that more precisely. But I think really, frankly, the bigger costs are the costs on the impact that it has on how we all live our lives, and the safety or feelings of danger that we feel because of the gun violence. And so there are things that other researchers have studied to show that, for example, when there's a homicide, children who live on that same block, it has an impact for weeks and weeks in terms of their ability to pay attention in school and benefit from all the work that teachers are doing in the classroom. So that's one very concrete cost that we don't often think of as part of the cost of gun violence. Steve Levitt, who's another U Chicago person, has done some work with other researchers showing that homicides drive people out of the city or prevent people from moving in. So if you think about a place like Chicago that is the economic engine for the region, if people are not moving here, if we cannot have this be a vibrant, thriving metropolis, it has huge costs, unfortunately because of the way that we fund education. If we don't have taxpayers in the city of Chicago, that also diminishes the quality of education.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you on that.
And I was just going to add the cost of what that person would have been. Did you kill the next doctor? Did you kill the next lawyer? Did you kill, the next pastor? What that person would have been and what they would have contributed. And I know stories of young people looking at colleges that were going to come to college in the city of Chicago, and because at that particular time there was a flurry of gun violence and they chose other schools.
Right. That's hard.
Can I just add one
Sure.
final thing on this? Sorry, and then
Yeah.
I do want to let the gentleman get in as well. Good luck with you 3 women on the panel. Just kidding. Sorry, I should not have said that.
Three
I
sisters,
apologize.
he
Strike
said.
that from the record. No, but I think one other thing that's important to realize is because gun violence so disproportionately affects young people, when you think about the sort of years of life lost, to your point, Congresswoman, that, obviously heart disease and cancer, those are incredibly important public health areas to focus on and put resources behind preventing, but gun violence affects young people disproportionately, and so we really are, when you add up the years of potential life lost, it really is a leading cause of death, and so I think it's important to recognize that it's not just that lots of people are dying, it's young people and all that potential that is lost.
Right. Thank you. I do want to talk a little bit now about legislation, which I think is often the first thing a lot of people go to when they start thinking for solutions. And it leads to really intense debate. And sometimes I think it's hard, it's overwhelming really to think about what it can achieve. But I do want to start with a recent piece of legislation that was introduced, I think about a week ago, that has to do with by Senator Durbin. It was a national piece about securing gun stores. And again, the story that we wrote about starts with a burglary. It just happened to be, we weren't writing about burglaries per se, but that's what it was. And The gun is taken, and about a month and a half later, evidence of it first shows up in Chicago. And there was legislation proposed that would, I believe, you can explain what it is, but it would ask FFL owners to secure their inventory.
Just it really
Beyond.
comes down to more accountability
Right.
on the part of gun store owners when guns are lost or stolen. But I will say I've been in the legislature since 2013, and when I first came in, that was right after Newtown and Hydeia Pendleton, and then it just kept on and on and on.
Right.
And that was my thought, you know, we're going to throw in this piece of legislation, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But in my years since, I still have legislation, but I realize that it's more than legislation. It's police-community relations, and even bigger, it's investing in these communities. It's investing in these particularly, even though it happens all over, but underserved communities. There's the, you know, there's a institutionalized racism part of it. You know, there's so many things that we're not going to legislate our way out of. So, what you spoke about is just gun store owners taking more responsibility and more accountability, from my understanding.
And I want to get to you about this piece of legislation, because the gun store owner that we wrote about had actually tried very hard and did secure her store. She'd been broken into once before, so she had cameras. She put steel reinforcements in a door to try to keep people out. And this legislation, I believe, if I understand it, would ask her to take an extra step of securing the weapons after hours or when the shop is not open. And I do kind of want, maybe, Ed, if you could speak on behalf of owners, is this a legitimate ask? And how do they feel when they're...
Well, there's a couple issues that go on here. First off, federally, all what are called FFLs, Federal Firearm Licensees. So you have to be licensed by the federal government to be able to sell and trade guns. They have certain protocols that they have to go through to document and so forth. In Illinois, in 2017, one of the first pieces of legislation that Governor Pritzker signed into law was a version of the federal license for Illinois gun dealers, FFLs. So we have a Illinois-based gun dealer act, if you will, that put additional burdens on FFLs to the point of what they're trying to do nationally. So we've had that in Illinois for the last, for 4 years, 3 years. It took another year to implement. It hasn't done anything to curb gun violence, and it hasn't done anything to curb gun violence because exactly what the Congresswoman just said, we're focusing on the wrong things. We're focusing on laws to hit the boogeyman that's the gun and not getting to the root cause. I mean, listen, guns are the weapons of choice. Gangs are the institutional program to create violence. And as policymakers, we have to get to why is there violence? Why are they doing this? And it's institutional racism. It's economic disparities. It's lots of different things that we as, well, I guess I'm a former policymaker. I'm not a policymaker anymore, but policymakers really need to tackle the tough stuff, the tough things of what's going on in our communities. And that's exactly what the Congresswoman just said.
Okay. And I think we'll get to some of those causes a little bit later. I did want to, I have to remember to take my mask off. I did want to deal with legislation up front and talk about what role that can play, because we do hear so much about it, and so I don't want to jump right over it. I think there's, Congresswoman, you've proposed a couple of other things, and I would love to hear from you. Why do it? Like, why is it worth looking at this, and what do you think works?
Well, I definitely think there's a place for legislation. I just don't think we can legislate our way out of the issue. Like, I do believe in background checks. We know who has a car, and it's been proven that background checks work. No, it's not going to solve every problem, because that's what you constantly hear when you put in a piece of legislation. Well, that wouldn't have done anything for that or that. But if it saves a life or 10 lives, it still did something. You know, closing what we call the Charleston loophole, and that came about when the young man killed the 9 people in the church. That there was a background check done. It didn't come back definitively no, so they were allowed to sell him the gun. And we know what he did with the gun. He killed 9 people. So now we passed it in the House. We passed everything in the House. It doesn't ever get passed in the Senate. It seems like.
This is the background checks, right?
Well, this is the closing the loophole,
Right.
the Charleston loophole. Neither one has passed in the Senate, the background check or closing the Charleston loophole, which deals with a loophole in the background check, so that if it doesn't, unless it comes back definitively, yes, they can buy a gun. That's the only way you can sell the gun.
Okay.
But also, like I believe we need national trafficking bills and straw purchasing. We've heard from alcohol, tobacco, and firearms that they've been starved as far as resources needed to actually do their jobs. And you guys just heard 60% of the crime guns don't even come from Illinois. And since I've been in the legislature, it's gotten easier to get a gun in Indiana. And one thing I always say is I am not against guns. I grew up around guns. I come from a family of law enforcement. I'm from New York. My grandparents owned a mom and pop store in New York. My grandfather had his rifle in the back of the store that I had to walk over every day to go to the bathroom. So I don't want people to think that, because that's what people think, that if you're for gun safety or gun violence prevention, you just want to take my gun away. And that is so not true. The head of our task force owns more guns than probably everybody in this room put together. That's his hobby, but he believes in gun safety, So I do think there are laws that are definitely needed. I have legislation around keeping guns out of dangerous hands at people that have been domestic abusers, because we've heard story after story. The guy goes to jail, mostly guys, and then gets out of jail, gets a gun, and then comes to get his wife or his girlfriend, And so I guess I look at it, I have common sense pieces. There's other legislation I don't even pursue those anymore, because again, we can't legislate our way out of it. There are just some things, programs and prevention and, counseling, things like that, because still more people die from gun violence, from suicide than, any other way.
So before we leave the legislation topic, though, Representative Sullivan, do you think there are any ideas, legislation, anything pending out there that you think makes sense, could move the needle in terms of protecting communities?
So there's two different, there's Illinois and then there's the rest of the country. We have very different gun laws when it comes to people that will actually obey the gun laws. That's the first issue. We have what's called a FOID card, Firearm Owner Identification Card. So you have to have that to possess a firearm. Clearly, criminals are not going to. 18-year-olds are not going to have this FOID card. So any law that you do is directed at legal gun owners, not illegal gun owners. Now, we did just pass legislation where I worked on the bill in Springfield that is going to, so you had this Aurora shooting, and you had the issue where the gentleman shouldn't have had a firearm. And it took a while for the state police to track him down. They never did. And so what do we do about those that shouldn't have firearms or shouldn't have a FOID card, therefore access to firearms? And so we just passed legislation, signed into the governor signed it this summer, where we're going to create a fund that is going to allow local government, or local law enforcement, to go in and go after those that shouldn't have a FOID card. So what does that do? That takes away some of the issues of people that might have mental instability that we don't know about, people that shouldn't have FOID cards, but that's a small portion of what we're talking about. You don't really see the gun violence happening in that area occasionally. It's in the cities, it's that type.
It did create, however, didn't it create the requirement for, in a private transfer, to go to an FFL, and that...
There were 3 things that the legislation did. It actually started up as a FOID cleanup bill. Right now, the state police are so far behind in allowing a constitutional right by the Second Amendment that they're trying to clean up their processes, make them more efficient to process applications and renewals faster. So that's the first part. The second part was what I just talked about. The third part is how do we do enhanced background checks between private individuals? So if I was going to sell a firearm to the gentleman in front, we would have to go through either an FFL and have the background checks done on a national level like they are, or we would have to go through the state police online portal, and then the person that purchased the weapon would then have to take that transaction record and file it with an FFL. What that does is it does an enhanced background check. Now, once again, though, we're talking about gun violence in the cities. How does that solve gun violence? It doesn't, because we are legal gun owners versus illegal gun owners. And so it gets back to what we talked about the whole time. How do we, as policymakers, get to the why is there violence question?
Right.
That's really what we're doing.
I'm going to interrupt you there and kind of step back, because I think now would be a good time.
Can I
I'm
just
sorry.
add one thing?
Yeah.
One, even though crime or gun violence has gone up all over, it seems like with COVID and all of that, but one thing, like New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, which are contiguous states, they actually worked together and had similar, and then you saw it go down, where Illinois is like an oasis in the sand.
Right. And by that, you're referring to Indiana and neighboring states
Big
where
time,
the
yeah.
laws are different, so people can go to Indiana. But I do think it's a good time now to, as a reporter, one of the top questions I get is, what is happening? What is going on? And I would like all of you, maybe start with the Congresswoman to try to explain, what do we think is behind the past 2 very troubling years? It is affecting the whole country. Definitely Chicago's numbers are very high.
Well, I still think it goes back to lack of opportunity, lack of hope. I think it goes to easy access to guns. I think COVID has something to do with it. Everyone's, locked up in their homes. I think that has something to do with it. I know people talk about mental health, but more people with mental health are victims of gun violence than actually are the perpetrators, I guess. But I just think it's a combination of things. I know we don't like to say, some of these things out loud, but sometimes parenting is an issue, but we don't like to say that, but that's an issue too. I just think it's a combination of things. But when I've spoken to young people that have gotten in trouble but made their way out of it, but had gone to jail, they just said they were, some on their own, know this is how they had to fend for themselves or their younger brothers and sisters. And I also think there was a disconnect from school because of COVID, and school is a stabilizer or part of a young person's foundation.
Rosanna, do you have any thoughts on?
You know I do. I'm just kidding. Well, I also wanted to sort of maybe slightly amend or disagree a little bit with what Ed said, just in terms of the gun being like not the issue. I mean, I do think that we have to recognize that we are not actually a more violent country. When you look at almost every measure of violence, sexual assault, robbery, battery, every sort of measure that's consistently tracked across international context, we're pretty average. The only place where we excel, we are number 1, is in lethal violence. And that is entirely because of gun availability in this country. I also have come to the view that because we are a patchwork of states with different policies, it is very hard for a local jurisdiction, be it a city or a state, to by itself regulate its way out of the gun violence problem that, absent sort of more comprehensive federal policy change, I think it is very hard for states to fix that by themselves. And so as a result, given the sort of bleak chances of really sweeping federal gun policy reform, I do think that probably the most effective short-term efforts are going to be what can cities and states do given those constraints, and then to sort of pivot to your question about what caused the spike in the last couple of years. I think it's sort of a combination of pretty much everything that could go wrong going wrong. A once-in-a-century pandemic that completely disrupted every aspect of life, and had, and especially in the communities that were already facing many of the most significant challenges in our society, to say that there was a rug underneath them is probably unfair, but to whatever shreds of a rug was underneath them, we pulled even that out from underneath them. So social services, the structure that school provides, the economic impact that it had on actually young men in particular seemed to be the hardest hit group of people in terms of the pandemic and the economic impacts. And then the crisis in legitimacy of government, and in particular in policing, where it's not as though the police department was a beloved institution before the murder of George Floyd, but I think take that on top of the pandemic, whatever trust or collaboration was happening or whatever sort of effectiveness there was that we were getting out of policing, I think was really diminished. And unfortunately, I think the more gun violence we have, the more gun violence we have. It's sort of a absent sort of things that will intervene to stop it, and I think there's extraordinary work.
And why is that? If you could describe that's the retaliatory nature.
Yeah, there's the retaliatory cycle and the fact that government has not been able to do a good job of providing justice to families and victims, because the clearance rate is something like 5% for non-fatal shootings. And so unfortunately, often one incident of gun violence will lead to a retaliation, which leads to a retaliation, which leads to a retaliation. And so I think, the pandemic and the crisis in legitimacy of government, I think in lots and lots of ways, and anyone who tells you they know definitively it is exactly this, I think is, I would take that with an enormous grain of salt. I think there are lots of things that were happening together, and it's not just the sort of policing, it's not just the sort of economic impact. It's a lot of those things, and it will be very hard, and people will be trying to look backwards for decades probably to really understand exactly what happened.
Right.
But the one other thing I just wanted to say is, when you think about who are the victims of gun violence and who are the people who are arrested, and so the sort of suspects in shootings, I think we have this sort of notion that it's a, quote, youth violence problem. The majority of victims of shootings and people who are arrested are 18 or older, and often, I think, much older, into their 20s and 30s. That's also the same group of people who are disproportionately affected by the harms of the criminal justice system that so many people are working so hard to reform. And so in some sense, it's the same population that's sort of bearing both sides of that equation of burden, the harms of the criminal justice system and the gun violence itself. And then think about what safety net has society created for adult men of color in particular. And to the extent that we have a safety net as a society, it focuses on women, children, and the elderly. And so to these men, we say we've basically got nothing.
Okay. I know you said it's as if everything that could go wrong went wrong. It also seems that there were some existing conditions that were never addressed. And I want to talk a little bit about that in the city and in terms of where violence happens and the concentration of it. Congresswoman?
Well, my district starts on 53rd and Cornell. I'm mostly in the burbs, but it starts on 53rd and Cornell, and I go all the way south to Kankakee. So I know some parts of my district on the south side of Chicago, and then, of course, on the west side of Chicago. That is where, I think it was in, they talked about 6 neighborhoods that, I don't know what it is now, but there was always conversation around 6 neighborhoods, Inglewood and Austin and Allgale Gardens, that area, and more, that gun violence occurred in. But that's where people felt more cops needed to be, or there needed to be more intervention and things like that. But even though it happens all over, but those were the primary areas, and those were the areas where you found African-American men in particular, or 18 to 24, they didn't have jobs. Maybe they didn't finish school, or just didn't have a support system around them.
So, we talk about the pandemic and how the pandemic has highlighted some of the economic disparities and some of the anxiety in society. Really, this gun violence started before that. 2016 was the highest level of murders in Chicago. A read that I think everybody should look at, specifically policymakers, and I know you and I discussed this the other night. Zachary Farden was the U.S. attorney for the Northern District, who was researching and dedicated his time to try and end the gun violence. He took it personally. He was an Obama appointee who was fired by Trump, and he wrote this letter. And this letter kind of talked about how did we get here? And where should we go from here? And he does talk about the things that happened in 2015, 16, 17. We talk about Idea Pendleton, Laquan McDonald. You had a superintendent that was fired at the time. There was an ACLU contract on stopping people and then having to document that interaction with people. And so you had morale in the police force that was down. A lot of them weren't stopping people because, you know what, I have to document this, I have to give my name and badge, am I gonna get sued, is it gonna cost against me? So then you had an uptick of people saying, well, man, I got free reign to do things. And so that just kind of fed into the mistrust, and then obviously we are where we are today. The pandemic has not done that. But the other thing he really talked about that proliferates this violence is what's happening with social media. And it comes down to, well, you shot my friend, I'm gonna shoot your friend, and it never stops. And then social media really exemplifies what's going on. And so Mr. Fardin really talked about that as we need to have tech geeks monitoring this and seeing what's going on and try and get to that. That's when we talk about what do we do going forward. Violence preventers, these programs, CRED, ceasefire. How do we get them involved in the communities? And so
right,
that's,
and I do want to
I know
talk
I'm jumping,
a little
so
bit
I'll
about that.
back
That's
off.
okay. No, I think 2016 is good to bring up because that was a troubling 50% spike, and then it went back to somewhat of normal. I don't know that it was the high water mark though, right? Was it 1974 or 19? Go ahead.
You want me to take over?
Yes, take over, please.
1992 was we had almost 1,000 homicides in Chicago, and then in 2016 we had about 777, 778, depending on how they calculated the numbers. But I think it is instructive both to see what happened then and then what the response was. And I think to your point, there were some really, I think, thoughtful steps starting to be taken, both around changing some of the practices in policing to try to create more accountability, have the police department be more data-driven, put more resources in the hands of commanders, which in the sort of context of policing here, commanders are like the chief of a small city. Our police districts are 100,000 people. That's a small city, and so much of the decision-making and resource allocation was sort of being centralized instead of saying, in this neighborhood, here's what's going on and here's how we can tailor our response. And we were starting to see some very beginning steps of progress, as well as some new investments in community-based violence interruption work that, it's sort of both of those things. I think none of us want to live in a world where we are relying on a law enforcement only or law enforcement primary response to all of these sort of social conditions that lead to gun violence happening. And so you were starting to see those things. And by 2019, we were under 500 homicides, which should not make any of us proud. That is absolutely scandalous when you think about cities like New York and Los Angeles that are per capita so much lower, and 25 years ago were at exactly the same rate as Chicago. Right. So it is absolutely possible without only relying on law enforcement. So it was not the high water mark, but there were things that started to happen, and then 2020 happened, and we're sort of back to where we are or worse. And maybe the final thing I just want to say is we are not at the, people often say we are not at the rate that we were in 1992, as though it's not as bad as it once was. And that's true if you look at citywide data. If you disaggregate by geography or by race ethnicity, and it's the same thing because we are such a segregated city, Chicago is now more dangerous for Black residents than it was in 1992. It is much safer for white and Latinx, even today, but for Black residents, they were better off in 1992, which was the peak of, that we think about the bad old days in our city. So I think we really, really do have our work cut out for us.
Okay. I think we are moving to questions and answers from the audience now, with a priority for the students. So is there anyone with a question for our panel?
Thank you all for being here to speak with us today. Such a fascinating conversation. I'm curious to get your opinions about the way in which policing gun possession in communities with high rates of gun violence results in over-policing of other lower-level crimes, which go policed at much lower rates in communities without as much gun violence, because you have fewer car stops, stop and frisks, et cetera.
Good question. Is there?
I almost need to hear it again.
Yeah. No, I think, well, I think what you're asking is if in an attempt to respond to the violence, they over-police in a community, what is the long-term impact of that?
How do you integrate that into your calculus when thinking about these gun violence prevention strategies?
Right.
Well, I mean, one, that is the issue when they over-police, because so many people I know, they just simply don't trust the police. And it's not just, someone 18, it's people I know that are, in their 50s and 60s and have such a negative opinion because of just their interaction. So I think that's what makes it, it makes it tough to solve the problem. Even I said that I come from a law enforcement family, generations, and even now. And when I think about my son, and there's some negative things that he said about the police, and I remind him, well, you're this uncle and this uncle and this cousin, but he doesn't care because of how he's been treated by the police. He's never gotten in trouble or anything like that, but just as a black man. So I really think building relations. I remember 2 police officers from Massachusetts, they were in Afghanistan, and they said they used tactics they used there, and it was building relations with the neighborhood they were in Afghanistan. And at first it was tough, but then people trusted them and started giving them tips and hints and things like that. And I just think the police really need to do that. Being from New York, I'm used to the police walking the beat. You don't see that so much here. And I think they have to get out their cars and build relations that will help.
A lot of what we're talking about, once again, I'm going to reference Zachary Fardand. He talks about the city of Chicago getting what's called a consent decree. In essence, it's a roadmap for police on how they should integrate effective policies, how they should be talking to people on the street, how they should get the trust of the community. So in 2019, City of Chicago introduced a consent decree. I think by the last look at the policies, we're about halfway there on what they should be doing. They've had to kind of revamp some of the things based off of an incident that took place over the summer where 2 young men were shooting off a gun. They ran, one kid ran down the alley, he turned, and he was shot. So they are working right now trying to figure out what should our policy be on foot pursuit. And so that's kind of dragged back this whole consent decree. But those are the policies and the guidelines that should guide the Chicago Police Department in these neighborhoods. And I don't have a complete understanding of everything that should go in the consent decree, but I know that's part of which that they're talking about right now.
Right. And I want to get to the questions, but that consent decree process is lengthy. I mean,
Yes.
it is, and it was.
Yeah, we're not halfway there.
Yeah, we're not
even-
even. I mean,
I don't even think we're 50%.
No.
No, we're
Yeah, and in 2019, I think, is when the formal document was even entered, and
Correct.
then, so.
Can I just say one thing, though, because I thought it was such an important question, and I think it is the question. We need to be working towards something that is minimizing the harms that come from any contact with the government and the criminal justice system, including policing. And I think in many ways that communities are getting the worst of all worlds. They're getting over-policed in certain ways, and then not the resources being devoted to solving, the ultimate loss. When you lose a family member and we're not putting resources behind making sure that there's closure for that family. And so I think gun violence is absolutely a devastating challenge facing communities, and I think it incumbent on policing to figure out how to reduce the gun violence with as few kind of additional costs and burdens and harms to the community, and also making sure that resources are being devoted to clearing cases so that families, get the closure and or the justice that they deserve. So I think that is the work going forward for policing in this country, is to figure out how to minimize the harms while having effective strategies.
Great.
Hi, my name is Annie Henderson. I'm a first-year graduate student at the Public Policy School. And my question is pretty simple. I moved here from New York City. I grew up in upstate New York, which obviously has a lot of guns. And I'm really interested in what makes Chicago unique. It appears that there's a crucible of factors that creates gun violence in Chicago. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on how it's different than the challenges that are faced in other major cities like LA and New York.
I'm going to pick on Rosanna because you've done work and you've been in LA and New York, right? You're quite familiar.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that, and you're probably too young, or looking at the historical data, that 25 years ago, New York, LA, and Chicago had exactly the same homicide rate. So still very different cities, different demographics, different social conditions, all of that, exactly the same homicide rate. We've been different in our homicide rate in two periods in our history. One was during Prohibition, during Al Capone era, and the other's right now. And so I do think that there are important differences, but despite those differences, we've looked exactly the same for homicides and shootings for almost our entire history back to the 1800s. So I think that when we think about what can we do to address gun violence, even though we have differences from New York City and LA, I still think that there are things from their playbook that we can be implementing. So number one, Los Angeles went through a very, very significant, decades-long police reform effort that cost many, many millions of dollars and had at the table and ultimately inside the police department individuals who had spent their careers trying to hold the police department accountable, suing them. They became head of constitutional policing. They really went through, and I'm not saying that they are where they need to be. There's still work to be done, but I do think that the consent decree that the LAPD went through was really, really important in helping them become a more effective, more constitutional, and more transparent. Still work to do. I also think that they have done a much better job of strategically investing in neighborhoods in both data-driven ways, but also in prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation in a way that we have not yet sort of gotten our act together in Chicago. I think, unfortunately, and I guess we don't have any aldermen on the stage, we are a city of 50 aldermen, and I think too often we're dividing up resources by 50 and not really saying where are the needs the greatest. And I think LA has done a really good job with their social service interventions and programs of trying to sort of have the need drive where the resources go. Still not perfect. And I think that still with all of the problems that NYPD is facing, they are still a much more professional, there's much more investment in their human capital. They do much better training of officers than we do. Up until the consent decree, all that police officers had to do, there was no in-service training. All that police officers had to do every year was qualify on their firearms. So we weren't training them, we weren't doing in-service training. And then New York City also, I think, has much more robust investments in social services and programs also in a much more data-driven way than Chicago has had. We're a very segregated city, and I think we need to really recognize that has additional burdens that creates. So when we're dividing up resources, we need to think about who's bearing the burden and not sort of just look at dividing up resources equally, but where is the need the greatest so that we can level the playing field and create opportunities in neighborhoods that have been left behind.
And to your point, I just left New York. I went and joined my colleague Yvette Clark in Brownsville, which was a very tough area, and that commander or whatever, he has done such a great job. I asked him if I ever wanted you to come and speak in Chicago, would you come? And also the reason I went there, because they're building a girls club, for coding, blah, 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 blah. So the girls have something to do after school. I guess they already have something for the guys, but to your point, the resources, and then they have the right commander there that made a difference in the neighborhood.
Hi, my name is Juliana. I'm a fourth year in the college, and I'm actually from Los Angeles. But for many of us in this room, we've all grown up in the era of mass shootings, and a lot of us have been through lockdown drills as children. I remember mine in first grade. So you all talked a lot about the different factors behind gun violence and how legislation isn't a complete fix. So what are some concrete changes we can make and concrete steps we can take to actually reduce gun violence in the United States today?
Thank you for asking that question because I didn't get to it before we had to switch. I'm not sure a lot of people in this city know what is really going on and has been going on. It's a little bit has been alluded to here, but I don't know, 5-6 years ago, there was a change in how we were going to address violence in the city. I am going to ask Rosanna again to talk about this because you've been involved in a lot of the programs, but there was a concerted effort to take an approach that borrowed a little bit from LA and New York, but also had a Chicago, it's kind of a Chicago designed.
Do you want to let them go first just because I'll go?
Sure, anyone,
Yeah,
I mean, anyone who's familiar
What can be
with
done?
the,
Sure. Well, you know, it really comes down to resources. You know, there's lots of ideas out there. You do have to attack the problem head on. Bringing in federal resources into the city that was done by President Trump, while at the beginning the mayor didn't necessarily want that, it turned out to be a good thing. It turned out that they were able to tackle some of the problems that were taking place. And so even the federal U.S. attorneys have said, we need more resources. They're at the lowest level that they've ever had. And so bringing in federal resources to attack that aspect of it. But we do have to get into the neighborhoods to see, you know, do we have youth centers in these high crime areas for these kids to go to? We don't. We need things like that. You know, in Illinois in January, we passed what are called the 4 pillars of the Black Caucus. In essence, it was to battle systemic racism, to battle economic disparities, but the 4 pillars were economic, they were healthcare, they were education, and they were crime. Well, I've always, not that I agree with everything that took place, of course. There's some of the crime things that I'm a little bothered by. But it's a start. It's tackling the problem at the problem. And so let that kind of play itself out and see if that will work. I think that those 4 initiatives will do more to solve gun violence than any anti-gun measure that you could put forth.
right, and oh, go ahead, please.
Now, also, I work very much on the grassroots level. So in my district, you know, there are different programs. There was a woman who started Kids Off the Block. She had 8 kids herself, but saw on her block, you know, what was going on. So she invited kids from the neighborhood to her home, and now she's helped hundreds and hundreds of kids and saved many lives. There's groups like Polished Pebbles. There's the Ready program. There's CRED, and I think there's a lot of good things going on in Chicago, but they need to be scaled up. Again, it costs a lot of money. There's My Block, My City, My Hood. That group. There's a lot of different Dem to Fem, Polished Pebbles, a lot of different people that are trying to step up with mentoring programs, educational programs, exposure, but there's more help needed, and they need to be expanded and scaled up, and that's where federal legislation helps too. There's a Stopping the Violence Act, a piece of legislation that will put billions into violence prevention when we get it passed.
Yeah, I agree. It comes down to resources. I think the most basic job of government is to keep people safe, and there is no question that our government has abysmally failed. And I think there are lots of different ways that those resources could help. I think that we dramatically underfund in education. Illinois is one of the worst in the country in terms of the way that we fund public education, and that's one of the best investments that we can make in improving life outcomes, including reducing involvement in the justice system and violence and other things, but that's a sort of a long-term solution. What Annie was referencing is starting really in 2017, there was a concerted effort to invest in more community-based anti-violence programming. But still, I think given the scale that is needed, it is still the tiniest of tiny drops in the bucket if we are really going to have long-term sustainable, healthy communities where gun violence is not a daily experience for so many of the residents. So I think to the question of what needs to be done, I think we need to continue to innovate. I think we don't have yet the playbook that we need to tell us definitively what works if we want to have an impact. There's incredible work and innovation that is starting to happen through CP4P, which is a constellation of community-based anti-violence organizations collaborating on doing street outreach and other services to try to stabilize neighborhoods that are experiencing the most gun violence. You mentioned READY, which we've been involved in, and CRED. Those are other sort of similar efforts, again, just scratching the surface of what's needed and not yet at the place where we know exactly what to do for whom in order to stabilize. And I do think that we really need dramatic reform in policing. I think that we're spending $1.7 or $1.9 billion on policing. I don't think we're getting ROI out of that, and I think it comes with accountability, it comes with better training and much more sort of being data-driven and focused on the things that are doing the most harm in the communities. So I think it does come down to community investments, but it can't be where every year these basically nonprofits that are in these communities don't know if they have the budget for next year. I mean, it's a terrible way to provide a fundamental basic necessity. And so I think we do need to rethink how we're funding these efforts. If we're going to outsource to community-based nonprofits, the most important and hardest job there is, then we need to have a different way of funding it so that it's sustained, they can count on it. And we also understand, what's working and what's not in a way that we just don't right now.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Sonia Bartia. I'm a first year in the college. And so I was curious because you guys are talking a lot about how it is underserved communities and the lack of resources they have that are the biggest causes of gun violence, both in homicides, and I was also add, the suicide epidemic is also a gun violence epidemic here, and that is also directly related to all of those things. But then you're also talking about investing into police reform that would change the way that police people interact with citizens, which the way I hear that is you would invest more money into policing to train police officers in order to do that. So my question is, how can we both fund things like education, mutual aid, healthcare, and mental health care if we are going to be focusing our energy and money on funding police reform programs to get police to interact with people in better ways?
Yeah, I just thought about and jump in. And when I think about how much money Chicago has spent because they've gotten in so much trouble with how their police have whatever you want to say, abuse citizens, if they could just take a portion of that money and put it in the training. I don't look at it one versus the other. I look at it, we have money to do both. I mean, Chicago has spent so much money in paying victims. If you could just use a portion of that money, it would go a long way. But I think there's money to do both. I mean, when I look at the federal government, we have appropriations money, for training, but we have appropriations for human services also.
So I want to piggyback on that. The numbers are actually $500 million over the last decade. So City of Chicago's paid out over, it's probably closer to $600 million. So $500 million in lawsuits. And so when we get to, and I know that the question talked about if you're adding to training police, well, adding to training police and getting this consent decree has an ROI. And that's what you should be looking at. I know that we talked over the problems that took place in the cities over the summer about, well, we need to defund police. Well, first off, the person that came up with that phrase should be fired. They should never be allowed to discuss this. It's not defund police, it's value add. How do we bring in the mental health professionals to help police, to help them engage on certain situations. And so that's the discussion that we really have. And that's a very big policy discussion that needs to take place, in my opinion. But that's the number, $500 million.
Yeah, and I just said we're not getting ROI out of the 1.9 billion, so I think we need to start by looking at how we can get more ROI out of the money that we're already spending.
Sure.
I also think the education system is $8 billion. I think there's probably ways that we can help the Chicago Public Schools do a better job serving youth and families. I also said that we underfund education. Our funding formula, is really not what it needs to be, and I think that's a state issue. So I think it is a matter of, in some cases, more resources, in other cases, really making sure that the resources we are spending, we're spending in the right ways with real accountability. And and I think we are in this really unique period right now where they have, thanks to the efforts of some of our federal policymakers, there are new resources coming into communities. I think it would be really, really important, though, to make sure that because those dollars are going to be spent down and go away, that we learn as much as possible about where those dollars can have the most impact so that residents, constituents can put pressure on local, state, and national government to fund the things that are making the biggest difference and doing the least harm.
Hi, I'm Ann Polcari. I'm actually a surgical resident here, going into trauma critical care, and I'm currently doing a 2-year trauma research fellowship. So this is an issue close to my heart, and to put it into perspective, we are looking at a lot of our data now that our trauma center has been open for just over 3 years, and 57% of our adolescent patients who have presented to our trauma center in the last 3 years have been a victim of a firearm injury. 47% of the adults that we see, so basically every 1 in 2 patients shows up with a gunshot wound. I think from our perspective, it's obviously a little bit different from the medical side. We're trying to do a lot of things to save lives, and that's a lot of what we look at, but we're also very interested in figuring out how to stop this. Looking at sort of the things that you've touched on, there's so many nonprofits and grassroots organizations working on this. It's sort of like after the earthquake in Haiti, where you had thousands of nonprofits going, but nobody was working together. I think it's sort of the same thing with our city, and even from the, I guess the way the city has spun this and saying things like homicides are down, but if you look at it, actually the number of shootings is up and homicides have gone down when our trauma center opened and we started performing miracles on patients who previously had to travel 6 miles for care. So I think my question is really, how do we get the city and the national government, what are the numbers, the research, the things that we need to specifically be presenting to them to convince them that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have people doing this and working on a grassroots level and being successful. Invest in that instead of police reform and prevention plans that only involve police reform and don't even really talk about prevention.
We do have, I've done press conferences with the docs, the whole thing about stay in your lane and all of that. So docs do come to the federal government and lobby and say some of the things you just said. So we do work with them, even when trying to put together legislation and incorporating their ideas. So they are active.
Yeah, no, thank you for the life-saving work that you do. I can't even imagine between COVID and the crisis in gun violence that you're dealing with. So really, thank you for what you're doing. And I think, I'm trying to be glass half full. It's very hard in this, the time that we're living through, but we got to keep doing the very best we can. And I am encouraged by some glimmers of positive things that are happening despite all of the sort of challenges that we're seeing. And I think there is now the beginning of a real both infrastructure in neighborhoods of community-based anti-violence organizations that are doing some of the hardest work there is out there, next to what you're doing, that, you know, out in the neighborhoods, working with the individuals that have been failed by every system, that are caught in this cycle of violence and justice system contact. They're risking their lives. They're trying to help stabilize and provide services. And they're doing it in a way that's much more collaborative than any time I've seen in all the years that I've worked in Chicago. So I mentioned the Communities Partnering for Peace. It's, you know, organizations working across 15 neighborhoods. They have a shared training center where they're doing accreditation for street outreach workers. There's a larger social service organization that's helping to coordinate the efforts of all of those community organizations. So I think there are really, really positive things happening, but nowhere near at the scale that is needed to really have the impact. And I do think it is important to not lose sight of, we don't just want to be working with the individuals that are now adults and have, you know, been failed, and now we're trying to undo some of the harm that's been done. We also do need to continue to stay focused on helping young people and families that are still school age after COVID, after being so disconnected from that infrastructure. I'm very, you know, we do work on the education side, and I'm very, very concerned about how many young people have really become completely disconnected from the school system, have been through extraordinary trauma, and we need to find ways to find them, re-engage them, bring them back in so that we can make sure that their needs and their families' needs are being met, so we don't continue creating systems that then, you know, require things like Communities Partnering for Peace to try to mitigate and undo all the harms that have been done. So I think there are some things starting to happen, but it's still not at the scale that's needed.
That's really high. I'm Hina. I introduced myself earlier. One of the things that we've talked about throughout this whole session is police reform. I know we weren't here to talk about it, but it's so inextricably linked that we talk about gun violence and police reform in this country, more so than at home. We had, in the UK, we had one fatal shooting by the police in 2020 to 21, 3 the year before. So we're able to progress a conversation about police reform without stopping at the hurdle of gun violence. In this country, given the level of death by police, police shooting, police contact, how much is that conversation ever going to move on police reform unless we fix gun violence first? Is it inevitable that we have to tackle gun violence? Because so much of the conversation around reform is, well, what would we have expected that police officer to do in that circumstance? How did they respond to a threat?